challenges. But this is very much on a more localised, sub-regional level than looking at single orbital systems going around outer London. Town centres I've already mentioned, we'll skip past that. London's growth corridors, an unutilised, in my view, policy area. We talk about it, we don't seem to have done much about it since the original South East Plan, which I remember back in the 60s talked about growth corridors, but we haven't really exploited that. And if I wanted to upset the planning profession in one swoop, I would say that's because they're unwilling to revisit Greenbelt policy, because it's Greenbelt policy that's the biggest barrier, I think, to being able to exploit the growth corridors that pass out of London, but that's a personal view, not the Commission's view. Skills, employment for the future, we need to focus much more on how we can utilise the existing centres of excellence in outer London to support that, especially in creative and media jobs where there is a high degree of skill level required. And I sit on the board of University College London in the centre, and a lot of the work of the university is in relating to the skill needs around it in central London and London as a world city, and utilising that and drawing in partners in order to raise the skill base with, for example, a new biological science park in the King's Cross area. And we need to take that approach into outer London and see what the opportunities are. Skip past that. How am I doing, Steve? Nearly finished? 3 minutes, thank you. Offices. The one thing I think that certainly my experience in the property industry is going to illustrate is that there is no future in outer London for large-scale office development. In fact, we thought very carefully about what defines a super hub. We came to the conclusion that what defines a super hub is not all the other criteria, but actually the ability to hold and attract 4 million square feet plus of office employment. It's not going to happen in outer London. It happened back in the 70s. When I worked in Croydon, we couldn't get enough. Everybody wanted to come to Croydon, the government, various insurance companies and so on, back office functions. That's been and gone. It's now out in the OMA somewhere else. And the basic economics, which is why I referred you earlier on to understanding the market, the basic economics don't work. To build offices in outer London of any kind of required quality, £30 a square foot. What's the most rent anybody's been able to charge in outer London? £25 a square foot. It simply doesn't work. It's not going to happen. What will happen, I think, is smaller, more focused, more specialised office developments, particularly in town centres, where they can be part of bigger mixed-use schemes. Again, ideally, I think in many ways related to the culture and media industries rather than large-scale office employers. So that is probably the future for offices, and I think that particularly fits the knowledge-based industries idea which we're exploring this morning. There are other slides, but I think they basically reinforce what I've been saying. So to go back to the key points on message, it's there, the opportunity for you. You've got to be aware of the realities of the market, the realities of what's going on, but the environment that's being suggested in the London plan makes it possible for boroughs and groups of boroughs and business groups in outer London to actually exploit that huge potential, that critical economic potential that exists already and can become better if we plan carefully and take those opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Will. Excellent, absolutely excellent. It's a huge subject, and no doubt if you want to talk to Will after this session, I'm sure he'd be very, very happy that you should do so. Our next speaker is Michele Dix, who started a career in the GLC, but I won't hold that against her, who then had 10 years in the private sector, joined and set up congestion charging, I won't hold that against her either, and is now Director of Planning at TfL, and will explain how TfL views all of this in the context of planning transport in London.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm glad that Steve Norris isn't holding those things against me.
Hey.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about travel patterns, particularly in the context of what Will said about what can happen in and out of London, because we work very closely with Will on the Outer London Commission. And because you're the creative industries, not only sort of like what we can do to help the creative industries form in outer London, but focus on how the creative industries, in the widest of senses, technological sense, can help us in solving our transport problems. So one of the main things that we have to resolve when we're looking at transport is how we can influence people's travel patterns. People obviously have to make decisions about whether they're going to travel, where they're going to travel, how they're going to travel, what route they're going to take. We can influence all those. We can influence it through the land use and transport planning route. The land use route is set out in the London plan that Will was referring to. We can influence it very much in terms of cost, not only what we charge people, but how easy it is to pay, how easy it is to sort of like have a transaction. We can particularly influence it with information. It's one of the things that came up very much in looking at the new London plan, the Mayor's Transport Strategy and Outer London Commission, is the lack of information that impedes people in their travel, particularly in Outer London. And we can obviously try and encourage people not to travel if they don't have to, and look at new ways of working. And certainly Philip is going to enlarge more on that. So if we look at current travel patterns in London, we can see that in the centre, sort of like there's not that much travel that's actually caused by the centre of London, even though sort of like Terry Fowell's drawings of London show all this radial movement going into central London. A lot of the travel in London is actually in outer London. 60% of trips that are made in London actually either have an origin or a destination or both within outer London. The problem is, though, is the further you go from the centre, the more that travel becomes car-dominated. And that's because the trips are more dispersed, and where people sort of like going to and from work are more dispersed, and the car becomes sort of like the best way of trying to get to work. So our job is to try and change that and try and influence that in some way. Not that the car is bad. In many instances, the car is the right mode of travel. But if you're going to use your car, try and use a smaller one that pollutes less. I mean, that would be the message that one would want to try and take. Or put somebody else or two or three more people in with you if you're going to use it. But the problems that we see on the roads today of congestion all over the place, not just in central London, and the crowding that we see on the tubes and the railway network today will only grow. These are the forecast demands for growth and population in London. 1.3 million more people. That's nearly 2 Leedses. So that's the size of growth that you're going to see. Two cities coming in, and 750,000 more jobs over the next 20 years. And that growth isn't sort of like inward migration. That's babies. That's Londoners having more children. Hence, we're growing. And we've got to accommodate that. And even though sort of like it's spread across London, there are still areas where there's more growth and more concentration, and we have to try and resolve those problems. So what we have done is we've actually developed, for the first time ever, integrated plans where we looked at the transport strategy at the same time as the spatial plan, i.e. where things should go, at the same time as the economic development plan, i.e. where do we want all the jobs and things to be supported, all with this key goal of supporting economic development whilst improving the quality of life, and in particular also trying to make a contribution to reduce climate change, because our mayor has set a target bigger than the government's target of reducing CO2 emissions by 60% by 2030, so 2025, so a big challenge. And all of those strategies, in terms of trying to support the economy, are still looking to one thing, influencing people's travel behaviours, and in particular, supporting travel where it needs to be made, encouraging people to think differently about when they don't need to travel, but if they are going to travel, trying to get more people walking, cycling, using public transport. Because we're going to see an increase from 24 million trips a day to 27 million trips a day. That's a lot of trips. And we want more and more of those to be made by the sustainable modes, and that's what the strategy is all about. And if we look at the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which links into those other two, there's 4 key policy areas, broad policy areas. One, sort of like better integration of spatial development and transport, and that's all about trying to encourage developers to locate new developments, preferably where there's public transport capacity already. I'm sure you're all familiar with PTALs, and that that's a good measure of public transport accessibility. So that's an important thing, and White City has got good public transport accessibility, so to develop here is a good starting point. The second one, which will take on increasing weight, particularly following tomorrow, no doubt, is getting more out of the system that we have already, making more efficient use of the networks that we have. They're very crowded during peak time, but in the off-peak and later in the evening, they're not so crowded. Can we encourage people to travel different times of day if they need to travel? And also, the actual networks that we have, can we make them more efficient in the way that they operate? Can we get trains running closer together so you get